Good morning, party people, and welcome to another episode of Office Hours. Why does it seem like, no, I guess the microphone's in the right place. It was like it was all of a sudden it was popping up there in my corner of view there. Welcome to a very warm Las Vegas. Holy smokes. So we set a record of like 291 days in a row without hitting 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And then about 2, 3 weeks ago, we broke that. We finally hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It had been forever since it had happened. It has been 105 plus every day since. And then this weekend, it's supposed to get up to 117 degrees. Now, thankfully, we just had our pool redone. Just had some rocks like repainted in our pool and repaired. Deval Blame Acceptor says, live in the oven. You should expect heat. We constantly joke that it's an air fryer when we step outside. It feels exactly like you're living in an air fryer. But so we just had the pool redone. It is filling up as we speak. I have to have it like a few inches below the rock line for the next 3 days, which also means I can't turn the heater on yet. It sounds crazy that I would need a heater, but we're refilling the whole thing straight from city water, which is like 65 degrees. You jump in there and you'll freeze to death. So I'm really excited to have that up and running right in time for the weekend to be over, but next week at least, because it's supposed to be for the next 2 weeks. It's still supposed to be over 100. It's absolutely crazy. G-Surgeon converted it over to Celsius. 117 degrees Fahrenheit is 47.2 Celsius. He says, wow. Yes, wow is the appropriate response there. And it's been funny for me because we had a visitor in, a friend of ours who's a photographer staying with us for the last few days. Shout out to Noah. And so Noah was here for the last few days. Well, we only have one car with 4 seats. It's a 1983 Cadillac. It's a 40-year-old Cadillac. And it'll overheat if you drive for like 45 minutes in 110, 115 degree heat with the air conditioning on. So we had to make our dinner plans based around, all right, I don't think we can get there in time before the car overheats. We're going to have to just eat closer to home. It was kind of funny how that worked. So let's go take a look at your questions. Good morning, SQL DBA. First question in, or the top voted question, is from Stockburn, who says, hi, Brent, we're using distributed always-on availability groups with OneNode and Amazon Web Services for disaster recovery. We're thinking of using this to quickly migrate the workload to the cloud by failing over to the DR node, building another server in AWS. Have you done this? Do you recommend it or run away screaming? So instead of saying AWS, let's just say, what should you think about when you're moving to a new environment, whether it's Amazon, GCP, Azure, a new data center for you, anything like that? You want the ability to do some load testing over there, or because most companies can't really do load testing. What you want is the ability to run out of there and then move back if all hell breaks loose. That's exactly what this kind of situation is good for. Now, not quite as much distributed availability groups. I just use regular availability groups for this because you can fail over back and forth between the two environments to check and make sure that you've got the right instance types. So what happens if you've got the wrong instance type up in the cloud and it's unable to handle your workload? You need a plan B. You need to be able to switch back over to on-premises for a few days while you get your act together up in the cloud. If you want to do that with distributed availability groups, the thing I would caution you on is if you're not already using DAGs, you're going to have a really hard learning curve. Distributed availability groups are probably the least documented production feature that I've ever seen. There's hardly anything available in there for troubleshooting, for example, when things go wrong. And I would hate to have you learn 2 new things at a time. One being your new environment, regardless of wherever it is. Going to Amazon is going to have some surprises for you. And also learning distributed availability groups at the same time. I try to only learn like one thing at a time when I'm doing work in production. Next up, developer who cosplays as a DBA asks, is parameter sniffing inevitable in a database that scales large enough? Not necessarily. You can have some databases that are fairly well skewed out. I'm going to give you an example, shopping carts. even if you have a giant site like Amazon, it is fairly unusual for people to put, say, 10,000 items in their shopping cart. So in a system like shopping carts, you're not really worried about parameter sniffing, because regardless of which customer cart you pick, it's going to have a roughly similar amount of contents, say between 1 and 100 things in their checkout. It would be fairly unusual for people to have much more than that. Developer as a cosplays, that's just one example. Of course, there are plenty of other systems that don't have problems with parameter sniffing. This is, or are there SQL Server rockstars out there who can write all their queries to be immune to parameter sniffing? You mean like people who attend my training courses? The ones on fundamentals of parameter sniffing and mastering parameter sniffing? No, sadly, no one has ever attended those courses. That is why I am forced to eat 99-cent cups of ramen noodles. It's why I commute back and forth to the grocery store by driving a Chevy Cavalier from 1984. And I only wear off-brand clothing, and I wear it inside out on some days because I can't afford a washer and dryer. Come on now. What do you think? I have a collection of cars from people who go to my training classes, and I hope, of course, that they actually use that knowledge and seem to get good reviews. Good morning, Greg at BMW. Speaking of cars. Next up, dirty-dba says, I'm tuning a sum query. If I remove all the indexes from the table, it makes the query run faster. I'm subscribed to your training package, but I can't get my head around why it's slower with indexes. You know, it's funny. It's not enough to just subscribe. You have to actually watch the videos. I actually have a whole class of customers, not like a training class, but like a class of customers who buy the training and then don't attend. I call them my collectors. I love my collectors to death, but they're not learning anything because they don't actually go to the classes. So in here, default blame acceptor says, oh, I knew there was a trick. So in here, what you want to do is start with fundamentals of query tuning. This is one of the first classes that you attend. You can't just buy them. And then you compare their execution plans back and forth to see what's different about them. Why did SQL Server choose something different for one execution plan than it did for another? So that's the place where you would start. Next up, Vishnu asks, how frequently should we be updating the first responder kit, SP who is active, Ola Hallengren's maintenance solution, and so forth? Now, the things that I would consider on that is, how often do you use those things? Which almost sounds like a trick question, but like SP who is active, how often do you actually use it? And how often do you go learn new features in it? If you never use it and you never go read the documentation on things like new features, then you probably don't need to update it that often. Ola Hallengren's, once you kind of set it, how often do you need to go back and poke around in it? On the other hand, if you're an active performance tuner like me, I rely on things like the first responder kit and SP who is active every day of my work. So I actually am working with a new client on Friday, tomorrow. So right before I go and work with them, I go check to see if there's a new version of SP who is active and go see what's changed inside of it. Fortunately, a lot of those don't change very often. DK Kimbo says, I want to buy your training and I want to know all the things immediately. How much is that plan? That's hiring me for consulting. And there are a lot of companies who do that, jokes aside. There are companies who say, we don't have time to actually have our employees go learn. How about if we just pay you a bunch of money and you come fix the things? And that is kind of like being a collector of my training classes. You're just paying a whole lot of money, but then instead I'm actually fixing things for you. Next up, Boutaga says, hi Brent, as a production DBA, I use templates, SSMS's template script folder. Wow, almost nobody uses that. It's really rare, so I'm proud of you. That's excellent. He says, I sync it through OneDrive. What tool would you recommend as a script repository that would sit between that and a local GitLab, or are there any? So I don't use GitLab. I use GitHub, which is Microsoft's hosted version. What I'd ask you is, what's the problem that you're trying to solve? It sounds like you want versioning of your backups, like that whenever things change, you want to go back through time and be able to access them. Me personally, I use Apple's Time Machine for that. Lets me go back through history for a folder and I can pick out any changes that there have been. So I use that instead because it just protects everything on my drive. If you wanted to do automated source control, you could look at Redgate's SQL, I think it's called SQL Source Control. I think it's like $500. I haven't looked at it lately, but Apple's Time Machine is good enough for me. Ugh, Bleona asks, what should someone do if they witness scripts or source that the IT manager brought from their previous company? What I would do is I would just talk with them gently first and say, hey, it looks like this says copyright whatever company, and that's not our company. Am I going to get in trouble for using this? And then just listen to what they say. Hear what they're going to say about, oh, maybe they didn't realize they had those scripts copyrighted from another company. They might say, oh, I wrote it and that's okay. That's not necessarily true, depending on their employment agreement. So if you're not wildly comfortable with the response, you can swing by your company's security department and have a discussion with them about that. Say, hey, just look, I know we're not supposed to use copyrighted things from outside if it's owned by another company. Here's something that I just want you to be aware of. I have no idea what's going on with that. Of course, there will be political problems with that when the other person finds out that you ratted on them to the security department. But if you're the one who's using those scripts because the IT manager gave them to you and said to use them, well, you probably want to get that ahead of that rather than when you have to go to court. Enka asks, can a SQL query be expensive without it being slow, or is slow and expensive mutually exclusive? When you say expensive, you mean the query cost? Query cost has nothing to do with the performance of the query. Here's what query cost is. Query cost is SQL Server's estimate of how hard the query is going to be to execute before it starts. You know how when your manager says, how long do you think this is going to take? And you say, oh, it's a quick and easy thing. I'll be done with it in an hour. And you're always wrong. Not like some of the time. You're always wrong. That's what SQL Server is going to use. There you go. Dilip says, are there any gotchas with using select top 0, C1, C2 to initialize temp staging tables? Yes, the way that you create tables can affect the way that their plans are reused. Now, you said temp, and temp tables mean something very different than regular tables. To learn more about that, I'm going to give you two options. One, the free option is you Google for Paul White temp table reuse. And he's got several articles that go into excruciatingly good details on how those work. And then two, go watch my Fundamentals of TempDB training class where I explain that with demos as well. Kind of make it easier for you to understand. Next up, Fernando says, several of our data files have file stats showing 99% reads versus 1% writes. Are there any optimizations to be out on the lookout for in this scenario? I don't think that that's a problem necessarily. What you want to do is use wait statistics to figure out what your SQL Server is waiting on. Maybe it's waiting on storage to be read. Maybe it's waiting on writes. Maybe it's not waiting on storage at all. Maybe it's waiting on CPU or blocking. So I teach you how to do that in my Mastering Server Tuning class, but the short answer there is go run SP Blitz first, since startup equals 1. And that'll give you your server's wait stats since startup, and then you can go start analyzing those to figure out what your SQL Server's been waiting on and what the cause of that bottleneck is. All kinds of helpful URLs in that scripts. Haluk Bilginer says, what is the top Kerberos issue you run into with your clients running SQL Server? You know what's funny? I don't do any security work at all. And in fact, my contract actually prohibits it. My contract says you cannot hire me for security work and I will not give you security advice. Clients have to read that before they hire me, and we also have a talk about it when they hire me. I say, all right, I'm going to be taking notes. Tell me what your goals are for this engagement. And as soon as it's anything security related, I just simply bail. Why? Security sucks. It's no fun at all. I mean, it's like none. I don't enjoy it at all. Companies often look at it as a waste of time and money. They don't see an ROI on it. Companies do see huge ROI for things like performance tuning, because I can save them on licensing, users are more happy, etc. I don't ever want to be dealing with double hop Kerberos issues again for the rest of my life. So I just simply opted out of that like 10, 15 years ago when I wrote my contract and said, here's what you can hire me for. So that kind of takes care of that. Janice says, we are on SQL Server 2016 and plan to migrate to 2019. I have a couple queries where memory grants are going through the roof. 1.5 gigabytes for one query. 1.5 gigabytes for one query seems big to you? This is a phone. Phones have more memory than that. I'm not really worried about 1.5 gig memory grants for queries unless thousands of that query are running at the exact same time. Janice continues, where can I find more info or deep dive on memory grants as all YouTube videos and Google doesn't help? I know 2022 adaptive. My mastering query tuning class. In my mastering query tuning class, I go into memory grants, show you the causes of them and what you can do about them. And I continue on with more of it in the mastering server tuning class as well. Kareena asks, what are the recommended online training courses for running SQL Server in an Azure VM? Kareena, go to brentozar.com, click training up at the top of the screen, and then scroll down the screen and there's a list of courses. And you know what one of them is called? And I'm not even bluffing. Running SQL Server in Azure and AWS. Enjoy. Can asks, what is your opinion of using Azure Backup to back up an Azure SQL VM? I don't have any opinion on it. I actually don't get involved in third-party backup vendors. The thing that I just look at is SP Blitz Backups. SP Blitz Backups is probably the least used. That's probably not true. It might be true. One of the least used scripts in the first responder kit, and I love it. What SP Blitz Backups does is it looks through your last 14 days worth of backup history and it tells you your biggest potential for outage. What was the longest time span that you went without taking a backup, successful backup? Let's put that in. In addition, it also tells you what's the longest estimated restore time based on how long your backups are taking. Like if you take a full backup every night at midnight and then you do log backups all day, well, the total amount of time near the end of the day is going to be a hell of a long time in order to restore your backups. So I would start with doing SP Blitz backups to just go and check yourself before, as the philosophers say, you wreck yourself. Often when I'm working with third-party backup apps, when I go and check that and I say, oh, hey, folks, let's just check this out. Looks like there was 4 hours in between successful backups here. And then if the sysadmins go, oh, we didn't know that. Okay, stop. Why didn't you know that? Because it's your job to know that. If you volunteer to back up my SQL servers, you need to know how long it is between successful backups. And if it's too high for the business to accept, you need to work on fixing that, and we need to monitor that going forward. Sean asks, hi Brent, did you have a chance to visit the volcano while you were in Iceland? Yes, multiple times, and it was glorious. Sean says, I'm debating booking tickets to go see the latest and greatest. So was I. I would go back again in a heartbeat. Iceland Air usually has really affordable tickets. There are a couple of things that you need to know. One is that wherever a volcano erupts, it's not like there's any tourist infrastructure. It likely erupts in the middle of nowhere. And in the case of the Iceland volcano, it's not too far from the airport. It's within a couple hours drive of the airport, but that's where the road stops. And then your hiking begins. And the hiking, there's nothing there to support you. There's no bathrooms. There's no water. You have to truck everything in. You have to have it on your back, everything that you need to do your thing that day, and then get out before darkness hits, because it will be cold. So just be aware of that. The people break ankles all the time, suffer injuries because there's not even a hiking path. You are out hiking on rocks. It's usually dangerous territory. The other thing to know is that you can also helicopter in. Now, you want to arrange, if you're going to helicopter in, you want to arrange that as quickly as you can, because often the helicopter flights will sell out for weeks once volcanoes start to erupt. You can sometimes get on last minute, but it's not easy. It's also not cheap. It's around $1,000 to $2,000. Harat, check out the URL on the screen, and then you can post your questions there as well. Next up, we have Pythor, who says, where is a good place to learn about source control for SQL Server? Really, at this point, there's only two ways you can learn it. One is Alex Yates's company. Alex Yates has a company that's like, if you search for Alex Yates SQL Server source control, I want to say it's called like DLM something or other, but he's got a website where you can hire him for training courses. Like he'll come in and teach your company. The other way that you can do it is to contact Redgate. Redgate Software has training courses on their own software, but they're really the big game in town for SQL Server source control. So start there. Next up, Rajesh Khanna says, what are the top issues that you see for shops that choose to use SQL Server tables as queues? Far and away, number one, blocking. And there are a couple things that you can do to reduce the blocking pain. One of them is to use RCSI, read committed snapshot isolation. The other thing that you have to do kind of in combination with them is you also have to use locking hints. So if you search for SQL Server queue RCSI lock hints, there are articles out there that talk you through the specific lock hints you have to use. I don't ever remember it. It's like read past and a hold lock or something like that. It's a pair of hints that you end up using when you're looking for the next available row in a queue, and I just never remember offhand what it is because I just Google it each time that I go and work with that. Satnam says, Brent, can you please help if there's any T-SQL to find DTU utilization for each session on an Azure PaaS database? I don't believe that there is. I don't believe that that's tracked in the DMVs. There is at the server level. So if you look at SP Blitz first, if you open the source code for SP Blitz first, don't worry, you don't have to read and understand it, but just open the source code for SP Blitz first and do a control F in there for DTU, database throughput units. And you'll see in the code where I'm measuring DTUs, and it's only available as far as I know at the database level. Oh, interesting. Giddy Up asks, is there any forensic evidence you like to capture prior to killing a long-running SQL agent job? It's a really good question. And what I would ask is, are you responsible for fixing it? In some shops, there's like one DBA and they do about anything. That's where DBA comes from. And they're responsible for troubleshooting why the job failed and what we need to do to make sure that it doesn't fail again next time. If that's your role, you would want to capture which query is running, what the wait stats look like, what the execution plan is, so that you can go figure out why that thing got frozen where it is. If it's not your job to troubleshoot, what I would do is find out whose job it is and then ask them, hey, is there anything that you want me to gather before I kill this thing? And if they're not around, just kill them and send, don't kill the person, but kill the query. Maybe kill the person, whatever. And then ask them later, hey, next time that this happens, what data do you want me to gather and how do you want me to gather it? And if they go, I don't know, then you don't bother gathering anything. Defina asks, can a given table simultaneously support both fast OLTP and OLAP queries, or is this not recommended? The way you like to think about it is that there are three dials that you can use. DK Kimball's right. There are three dials that you can use to adjust SQL Server performance. One of them is the table and index dial. You can work on tuning the table, denormalizing for reporting, normalizing for transactional use. There's that dial. The next dial is query design. You can put a whole lot of work into how you tune queries so that they run as effectively as possible. And then the third dial is the hardware capabilities. How much hardware do you throw at the problem? So when I'm working with clients, I'll say, all right, here are the only 3 dials that I have. These are the only 3 dials. We can tune the indexes and tables, we can tune the queries, or we can tune the hardware. Which one would you like to do? And sometimes clients will say, well, we're just willing to throw any kind of hardware at it because we don't have a whole lot of time to change the table design or to retune our queries, in which case, absolutely, throwing hardware at it can absolutely solve this problem. Dad Joker Detroit says, if a SQL developer recursively bangs his or her head, will they end up with a CTE injury? You don't hear a lot of database jokes, so I totally have to salute that because it's really hard to find good database jokes. And unfortunately, we're still looking. Dumitru says, can I enable accelerated database recovery always on basic availability groups and log shipping on the primary replica of SQL Server 2019 Standard Edition? I don't know. Can you? Can you? Sometimes when you have a question, it's faster to try it. Why not? Try. That's how you learn. KG says, what's the best way to migrate or update an existing availability group to a new SQL Server and a new SQL Server version? I'm looking at log shipping versus using the existing availability group. I am a huge fan of log shipping because it requires no changes to the existing availability group. Sometimes the reason why you're replacing a production server is that old production server is a teetering disaster. It's got like scabs all over the place. There's smoke coming out the side. And if you touch it, the whole thing's going to collapse like a quivering pile of jello. So I like log shipping instead. I like just being able to restore the databases over on the other side. That way I don't have to break the production server. Eduardo says, how are the advertisers for your Twitch stream chosen? Twitch manages the ads altogether. Same thing with YouTube. That's one of the nice things about streaming, is that they just take care of that for you. I assume that it goes to some kind of highest bidder, whoever chooses the high bidder. Be aware that the way internet advertising works is you often see personalized ads based on your browser history. So Eduardo, no one else is seeing things for adult sex toys. That's only your video that's showing that. I want you to know that I don't have some kind of relationship with adult sex toy companies. That's just purely based on your browser history, Eduardo. SQL 100 says, in one of your Q&A sessions, you mentioned that creating indexes on foreign keys will have an efficiency on retrieving the data. Does that include having multiple columns or just that foreign key index? So the more columns that you index, the faster it will be to pull that data out of the SQL Server. I can't really do a short answer version of that. Check out my Fundamentals of Index Tuning class, Fundamentals of Index Tuning, and I go into details on there. It's about a day long. It's recorded. You can buy it and then have access to it as much as you want. SQL Dev DBA says, sir, you can't browse that website in a public library. And then last off, Mike says, I can't download SQL Server Azure data to Excel with an MFA login, only SQL Server Authentication. Is there a way using MFA logins to download Azure data into Excel? I have absolutely no idea. You know, every now and then people will say, Brent, it seems like you know the answers to everything on the stream. This is a good example of where I have no idea. So me personally, I use, this is going to be hard for some of you to swallow, I use a Mac. I use a Mac for my day-to-day stuff, and so Excel on a Mac is a poop show to begin with. It's so bad. Yeah, I'm older than you are, but I can actually remember where I had to go click a button in order for Excel to go recalculate, and it would take like visible time to recalculate the formulas. That's the feeling that I have when I use Excel on the Mac. It's like sluggish, even though this thing is hella fast. So I just don't use Excel if I can avoid it. It's not to say I don't like Excel. I adore Excel. Those of you who use Windows, you have no idea how lucky you are with Excel on there. Same thing with PowerPoint and Outlook. Really, they're phenomenal pieces of software. But on Macs, they suck butt wind. They're just awful. All right, that's perfect timing. That is the end of the question queue, and it's 45 minutes after the hour. It is time for me to go check on the pool downstairs and go see how close to the rocks my water has filled up. If you're ever curious about how long it takes to fill up a pool with a garden hose, it's looking like about 18 hours. So, excuse me, so far. And the pool has a kind of an interesting auto refill thing because in Vegas, some of the water disappears from the pool due to evaporation, especially if you run like a fountain or a waterfall. So I have an automatic refilling thing. I didn't drag a garden pool out there or drag a garden hose out there, but there's basically the equivalent of a hose underground that whenever the water gets below a certain level, it just starts gushing water back in, which is pretty cool. Lucifer says, I still say you look better in the black cowboy hat. I wish I would have kept that. That is a throwback there. Dell DBA days in Austin, Texas, or Round Rock, I think it was. Yeah, it's been quite a while. DK Kimbo says, from Iceland to Vegas, Brent likes extremes. It's absolutely true. Like, I want to be around amazing, beautiful places. Coming up at the end of this month, I'm going to another amazing, beautiful place in the U.S. I'll do a recorded office hours from there. I don't want to say what it is yet because it's a surprise to Eve. Eve doesn't know where we're going yet, so there we go. Well, thanks for hanging out with me. D. Tovey just popped in at the end, and I will see y'all on the next office hours. Adios.